All right, let's look into the scripture this morning. 1 John chapter 4 is our passage. 1 John chapter 4. What a beautiful morning it's been today. And thank you, each one, for taking part in worship. 1 John chapter 4. And we're going to go to the end of the chapter there, verse number 15, or near the end at least. 1 John chapter 4 and verse number 15. Whosoever shall confess that Jesus is the Son of God, God dwelleth in him, and he in God. And we have known and believed the love that God hath to us. God is love, and he that dwelleth in love dwelleth in God, and God in him. Herein is our love made perfect, that we may have boldness in the day of judgment. Because as he is, so are we in this world. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casteth out fear, because fear hath torment. He that feareth is not made perfect in love. We love him because he first loved us. I want to focus on that theme of perfect love, really, in a measure at least this morning, but particularly in the area of fear. You see, right now, we're in so much turmoil in a variety of ways, and some of it's spiritual, and all that's happening in kind of even this weekend, and the sort of, at least in some cases, maybe the forces of darkness just seeming strong, and it's almost, it's kind of a contrast between October 31st and November 1st, where you have the whole goblins and horror and all the other things on the 31st, and then it's supposed to be All Saints Day on November 1st. So anyway, you have all that going on, but then there's a variety of other things, whether it's international conflict or political turmoil and unrest and all of those things. And so sometimes we may struggle a little bit, because if we're not careful, we can allow the fear to grip us that perhaps would be even debilitating and defeating our purpose. Now, when we start looking at this passage, this is not just saying that you'll never be afraid again about anything if you have perfect love. However, there are some fears and some issues that we need to recognize that those things should be taken away when we completely yield ourselves to God. And so this morning I want to kind of try to deal with that a little bit, and what is actually meant by this lack of fear, and how can we really truly overcome all of the pressure and all of the discouragements and all that conflict that's going on in our world today. I don't know whether you've ever heard of Alvin. He's sometimes called Shipwreck Kelly, but he had this kind of the idea of no fear, I suppose. Back in the 1930s, he was pretty prominent, and I have a book that shows a picture of him on Friday the 13th, October 1939, and he spent the day standing on his head on a plank all the way up there at the top of New York's 56-story Channon building. He was trying to, shall I say, promote a message of freedom from fear, I guess. He's going through all the sort of the bad luck things. It's the Friday the 13th. He even ate donuts while he was up there, which apparently was supposed to be somewhat of a bad luck thing. I'm not sure. It seemed like there may have been something else as well, but, he's up there for all this time. Now, in the picture I saw, it almost looked like he maybe was tied by his wrist or something, that if he had messed up, maybe he would have been saved. But anyway, he was doing all these things to try to show, no fear. I'm not afraid of bad luck or whatever else. And, maybe there's something to be said for some of that. However, our lack of fear goes a lot further than just, what about the bad luck things or tempting fate, as some people might refer to it. In this case, John is saying that we do need to have our fear cast out. Now, let me just stop for a moment to notice with you, some people like to quote this verse and say, perfect love casteth out all fear. I've heard it that way before. Not all fear. There are some things that we are naturally afraid of, and it's part of, could we say this is a part of the curse? If, for example, I'm going over to Africa for a visit. There are some rivers that I'm not going to even try to get close to, probably. I certainly am not going to go wading in them, because there may well be a hippopotamus there, and they're vicious. Maybe out in the say the savannah or the veldt area, and you go out there and there's a lion, or maybe I guess they call them a pride of lions, and you go out there. I'm not just going to go out and mingle with them. There is a natural fear there, and that's not what the Scripture is talking about. However, there is wrong fear. There's a sort of a slavish fear. There are those things that we may be afraid of that perfect love can cast out, and especially in this area of spiritual things. Not just that you'll never be afraid of the dark again or thunderstorms or whatever else, but you don't have to have a spiritual fear. Now, this perfect love that's referred to here was sort of a favorite term of John Wesley in referring to that complete surrender that we call sanctification. And he loved that term, the idea of holiness being referred to as perfect love. And really, when our love for God and for others has been made perfect, has been brought to fullness, then we can live above those fears that count, shall I say. The spiritual fears and those things that may keep us from doing what God would have us to do. So maybe I could just simply ask this question as we kind of get rolling here this morning. The first question that I would give to you is, are you afraid of God? Now, you might think that's a strange question, but it might surprise you how many people have somewhat of a fear, like more of a slavish fear. I'm not talking about reverence. I'm talking about more of a slavish fear of God. And they fear that He is sort of really standing there with a club, and He's ready to beat them over the head if they do anything wrong. And they're afraid to approach Him and all of those things. And so maybe we ought to think about that a little bit and consider it. What really do we think of God? Do you think of Him as a cruel judge, that we would have to tremble in coming before His presence? Well, I'm sure there's an aspect of that. I mean, when we have to come before God as our judge, I believe there will be I don't know if I want to say fear, but there will be an awesomeness about it. And maybe we will tremble in the light of His holiness. Maybe another question I could ask you, do you tremble or do you get anxious? I mean, anxious about Christ's return? Does it bother you to think that He may come back? Does it trouble you? Perhaps there's a variety of applications to this, but I want to touch on a couple of them anyway today. This area where a true love relationship with Christ really makes the difference. If I truly, properly have a perfected love in my own soul for God, for Christ, then there are some things that shouldn't be as much of a problem anymore. And so the first one that I'm going to notice with you, not necessarily just talking about fear this whole time, but it's related. So the first one I want to notice with you comes from, let me get the correct verse, 17. Herein is our love made perfect, that we may have boldness in the day of judgment. Now, wouldn't you say that fear and boldness are opposites? Or at least pretty well on opposite sides of the spectrum, at least? Well, yeah. And so if we are coming before God with boldness, then fear has somehow dissipated. Somehow we're free from that. And so notice that this first aspect is that friendship with God, a true love relationship with Him, friendship brings boldness. Again, notice that John covers the issue of our perspective here. The perspective of God, the perspective of the judgment. And he's saying we can have boldness in the day of judgment because as He is, so are we in this world. Again, when we have a proper and perfect love for God, governing our heart, governing our actions, ruling and reigning in every part of our lives, we don't have to cower in a corner and think, oh, I wonder what God's going to think. I wonder if I hope He doesn't come back yet because I don't know. No, that's not the way we should be acting. And I think just recently we covered that a little bit with that whole idea that we can come just knowing He cares for us. But we have confidence, we have boldness because we are friends with Him, because we know Him. I'm not talking about some sort of a brazen, self-assured way of coming before God, but when we know He's our friend, when we have a love relationship with Him, then that fear to face Him is gone. We can be bold. We can know that all is well. We can know that He'll be pleased. I've mentioned numbers of times, I suppose, two aspects. Either the aspect of hearing Him say, well done, or seeing Him smile at His child. Those two, either one of those, however they may be related, those two things have to be among the finest, the most joyous of any soul ever created. To have boldness to come. Now, there may be some of this fear that's the result of our relationship with our own father sometimes. And I'm not trying to put everybody in the same box necessarily. If our concept of God is poor because of our home life, and I don't know all about your fathers, but if your relationship there was strained, if he was harsh, if he was a sort of a tyrant in the home, it's possible that you maybe would struggle with that a bit. So I understand, in at least an abstract way. My dad was great and gave me a good foundation for how to look at God. But sometimes, having this fear, being afraid to come before God, not being comfortable in His presence, can be a signal at least that maybe there's some spiritual work to be done. Maybe we need a little more of God's touch upon our soul. We're told in Hebrews that we can come boldly before the throne of grace. That's chapter 4 and verse 16. And then later on in Hebrews, also, of course, throughout Hebrews, there's a lot of this issue of our high priest and how Jesus has paved the way for us to come in. So later on in chapter 10, we also can see that we can draw near with a full assurance of faith. Chapter 10, verse 22. And so really, because of Christ, because of our relationship with Him, because we have a friendship with Him, we can come boldly. We don't have to be, again, cowering in a corner somewhere. We don't have to be afraid to come before Him. But we do have to love God perfectly with our heart and soul and mind and strength. Might be good for us just to pause there for a good little while. We're not going to do that this morning, but maybe we ought to pause there and think about what all that impacts. That every part of me loves God completely, fully. Whatever He wants from me, whatever I can do to please Him, that's what I want to do. Loving God completely. Perfect love casts out the fear of coming before Him so that we can come with boldness. It's kind of based or hinges on our friendship, our relationship with God. Not only that, but we also would notice the freedom from bondage. Freedom from bondage. There is no fear in love, verse number 18. But perfect love casteth out fear, because fear hath torment. It sounds like bondage, doesn't it? To be tormented in our soul and our spirit by this fear. And there's a variety of ways that can apply too. Obviously, first of all, we have to have that relationship that allows us to come boldly before the throne of grace, boldly before God. Again, I'm not talking about some brazen way of thinking that somehow I've got something worked out with God and he can't send me to hell because I have all these credits to my name, whatever else. But then there are some other aspects here in this bondage idea. We can be free from bondage. The pathway to perfect love is only through a full surrender to God. We need to recognize that. That's what perfect love is going to be. And some may look at surrender to God in that way, yielding our will to Him as bondage. They may feel like, I wouldn't want to give up my right to control my own life. I wouldn't want to really just take my hands off and let God have control. They feel like that would be bondage. But in reality, when we give our all to God, then we're made perfect in love. We are given His Spirit to rule and reign in our heart. And that delivers us from the torment of fear. When self is on the throne, we're too focused on fear. It's fear about a number of things, and maybe we could just touch on some of those even here this morning. Maybe we even think that we're surrendered, but sometimes there may be this issue of fear that rises up again. And so it might be good for us just to touch on that for a few moments. What might be the first fear that we struggle with if we are not wholly yielded to God? Well, I suppose there'd be several of them. One is the fear of opinions. What do other people think of me? Am I really able to serve God fully because of so-and-so, because of what they think, because of how maybe they will view me or treat me? We'll touch on maybe the treatment here in just a little bit. What's the other's opinion of me? Now, I want us to recognize that our ultimate goal has to be to love and serve God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. We've already mentioned that, but I want to really get that into you. We have to live that way. We have to be really focused on what God thinks. But so often, if we're not careful, we can allow what everybody else thinks to govern us. And sometimes we might even go to church on Sunday because of what somebody else is going to think. Now, I know there's something good about positive peer pressure, but we should not be here because of what somebody else is going to think. I mean, apart from God. It ought to be about, how can I please God? What is He going to think? Is He going to be pleased with me? So really, that's where we ought to be kind of drawing the line. It's not about what everybody else thinks. I shouldn't be in bondage to everybody else's opinion. Now, I'm not saying we just throw off all restraint and we let me be me and you be you, and nobody can say anything about, how we would act or whatever else. I'm not talking about that. I know that's sort of this modern mentality, but what I am saying is sometimes we are so bound to other people's opinion that we can't serve God like we should. What will they think if I testify? What will they think? Again, some of this is in the negative side. What will they think if I witness, speak out, tell somebody else about Christ? What will they think if I invite that person to church? Okay? So we're sometimes governed by, I'm afraid they'll think bad of me if I do the right thing. There are other times that maybe you would say this is a little bit more on the positive side, and in one sense, I guess you could reverse those depending how you want to look at it. But maybe, I'm not gonna do this because they may not approve. And sometimes we can, in a sense, we go through the motions of Christianity. I'll just sort of sum it up and we'll move on. But we got to go through the motions of Christianity because of what somebody else thinks. Because we want to fit in. But really, it's not about pleasing. I don't want this to sound wrong because I understand there's a proper aspect maybe in some ways, but it's not just about pleasing the Pharisees. The reason I mention them is because that seemed to be what the people had to do. You had to please the Pharisees or else you were out. You'd be excommunicated, so to speak. Fear of opinions. What about other people? And then besides that, then you have also another fear that is bondage, and that is the fear of obedience. If my heart and soul is not wholly yielded to God, then I may be backing up or I may be resisting. Oh, I'm afraid. I'm afraid to mind God because I'm afraid He's going to ask me for this. I'm afraid He's going to tell me to go there. I'm afraid He's going to tell me to witness to that person. I'm afraid to obey. And that's pretty common too. And we need to be careful that we don't somehow get enslaved to self. I don't want to obey that. I don't want to do that. And so in the process, we miss the blessing of freedom to just simply walk with God, say yes to Him, and let Him govern our lives. I know, again, for many that might sound like bondage. I have to do what God said. But in reality, obedience is the best way to live. And when we're afraid to obey, it is bondage. The third one is fear of opposition, and we've already touched on that a little bit. But let me just mention it to you again. Sometimes we wonder, what's this going to require of me? What's it going to cost me when it comes to other people? What will they think? How will they respond? Will they understand? Will they mistreat me if I do what really is right? Fear of opposition. What's it going to cost me? John kind of sums it up here a little bit more black and white than we might prefer. What does he say? He who fears is not made perfect in love. And therefore, he has to surrender more to God. He has to just kind of go a little further and recognize, okay, well, if I'm afraid of everybody else, if I'm afraid what they're going to think, and I'm hindered in my walk with God, then I have to dig a little deeper. I have to go a little further. I have to allow God to give me true freedom in Christ. A total love for God cancels out or helps us to overcome that love of self that would be so apt to put us in bondage. I know we may not think about that this way very often, but I want you to recognize that while we think we are free doing our own thing, calling the shots, as we sometimes say, making our own choices, in reality there is a bondage that comes with having to have it my own way. And so this morning I want to urge you to let God give you a perfect love for Him. It's not about what other people think. It's not about what other people do. It's not whether I fit in. What matters is, do I love God completely? And so let's just deal with a few important questions here this morning yet before we go. Do we really love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength? That's the bottom line. Do we really, truly? Or do we just try to fit in enough to get to heaven? Are we suitably bold in coming into God's presence? Are you comfortable when God draws near? Are you prepared to enter His presence as far as, we think of heaven and for eternity and all those things? Maybe I could also ask you this question. What kind of fear crops up when you are called to obey the Lord? In closing, let me just urge you, don't try to get by with as little as you can. As small a surrender as you can get by with. But instead, be committed completely in perfect love. A love for God that says, I'll do whatever you want, whatever it costs me. I want to please you. And when we do that, we are set free. There's no fear in love. Again, I'm not talking about some slavish fear. Maybe I shouldn't say it that way, because slavish fear sometimes is a spiritual issue, but sort of maybe I should say a natural instinct of fear. I'm not talking about that. I'm not saying you should never be afraid of, like I said before, thunderstorms or wild animals or whatever. But we shouldn't be afraid to come before God. And so maybe we can just sum it up with that question. Are you afraid to come to God? To come before God, to stand before Him, to face Him? God help us to be totally, completely surrendered in every part of our life.